Few inventions have had a greater impact on how we live today than the airplane. From the largest passenger plane ever constructed to a tiny airline that revolutionized flying. From the all-out war between the last two airplane manufacturers to the threat of death in overcrowded skies. This is the story of flight at the dawn of the 21st century.
Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
All passengers on board Mexican Airlines Flight 917 with United Codeshare Flight 4435 and Air New Zealand 4217, código compartido con vuelo de United 4435 y Air New Zealand 4217, con destino directo a la ciudad de Guadalajara.
The 747 was an airplane so much larger than any that had been built before that it boggled the mind to think it could fly. Its body seemed to stretch as far as the eye could see. It was grand, in the spirit of ocean liners from a bygone era. It promised to carry more people to foreign lands than any airplane ever. And yet, the 747 came within an eyelash of bankrupting the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. This is the story of how an airplane went from ugly duckling to swan. In the late 1950s, with his retirement approaching, Juan Trippe, the head of Pan Am, chose New York City to build a modern monument to himself.
As you drove down Park Avenue, which in many ways is the most celebrated avenue in New York City, you couldn't see very far because the Pan Am building blocked it right in the middle. The street eventually went around it on both sides. But coming at the building, you saw Pan Am in enormous letters on top. Why did Trippe want that? Wouldn't you in his position? He could, therefore why shouldn't he? And he didn't put Juan Trippe up there, he put Pan Am. He was Pan Am.
But even the largest office building in the world was not enough for Juan Trippe. Looking back on his 40-year career in aviation, a nostalgic Trippe was ready to take one last gamble.
He was considered charming, articulate, visionary, of course. He knew just how to go at people to get what he wanted. And he had this enormous drive, an enormous ability never to take no for an answer, to keep coming back to it.
Since the end of World War II, Trippe's goal had been to transform air travel from a plaything of the elite into an experience that was affordable to the masses.
He made a number of speeches saying that the bombing plane is going to be done in by the tourist plane. He meant that we had to visit each other's countries. We had to get to know each other. We had to not hate, you name it, not hate the Belgians because we don't know any Belgians. We have to go there and they have to come here. He believed that Pan Am, because Pan Am was the only company doing it for so many years, was really fostering international brotherhood.
Trippe's approach was working so well that by the early 60s, Pan Am was having a hard time meeting the demand for tourist travel. Airports were struggling to handle the constant stream of jets. Everyone was talking about the need for a solution to the traffic jam. To solve the problem, Tripp envisioned a jumbo jet, a true ocean liner of the air. He went to William Allen, the president of Boeing, to sell his idea for the new airplane.
Warren Tripp at Pan Am and Bill Allen at Boeing had a sort of classic combative relationship of the buyer and the supplier, but they were locked in together, and they both had a vision that the industry could be transformed.
Although they were too suspicious of each other to become close friends, Warren Tripp and William Allen often vacationed together. Their most important trip of all, a fishing vacation off the coast of Alaska, was recounted in the book, Birds of Prey.
They hired a classic old yacht, Wild Goose, owned by John Wayne and rented out to rich tycoons, who hoped perhaps that some of the old movie cowboys' grit would rub off on their commercial adventures. Their wives went along for the trip, but this was basically a man's holiday, an exercise in commercial machismo. Between jousting over the merits of different fishing grounds and over which line and tackle to use, the two men explored the idea of the new plane. Eventually, it came down to a kind of dare. "If you build it, I'll buy it," said Tripp. It was a gauntlet Allen had little choice but to pick up. "If you buy it, I'll build it," he replied. Nothing signed or sealed, but by the time Allen returned to Seattle, there was an understanding that Boeing would build a new plane and Tripp would buy it.
Boeing named the airplane the 747. Warren Tripp gave them only two specifications. It had to be big and had to double as a cargo plane. Boeing engineers were concerned that in a hard landing, cargo containers might slide forward and crush the pilots. To solve the problem, they designed the characteristic hump of the 747, enabling them to place the cockpit on a deck above the cargo containers. There would also be room behind the cockpit that Boeing engineers thought could be used for navigational equipment. But an enterprising Warren Tripp came up with a more creative idea for the extra space.
Tripp remembered the opulent accommodations of the double-decker B-314 flying boats and the stately Boeing Stratocruisers. They had sleeping berths and lounging cabins and dining rooms. Stewards in starched uniforms served dinner with real china and silver service. They were ocean liners of the skies. Tripp had an idea. Why can't we have a cocktail lounge behind the cockpit and a spiral staircase?
The 747 Cocktail Lounge would bring back the romance of flying to air travel. Soon, it was the talk of the town.
A spiral staircase. Very plush.
Hey, I think I've got it. It's a townhouse in New York, isn't it?
No. No, it's more like a chic new lounge.
No, it looks more like an ocean liner to me.
Why the cocktail lounge on the upstairs of the 747? I'm sure that he was thinking of the Stratocruisers, which had something similar. To him, he knew he was leaving soon. He was by then in his late 60s. And he was a chance to go forwards and backwards at the same time. I think that would appeal to almost any man.
Tripp may have had his dreams, but Boeing's engineers were the ones faced with turning them into a reality. One of the biggest problems was building engines powerful enough to lift the 747's massive weight.
William Allen says that what he remembers best about the engines is that they didn't work. Boeing used 87 engines in testing the 747. 60 of them were destroyed in the process. At one time, Boeing had 4 747s to be tested and couldn't get more than one of them off the ground at a time. By 1969, finished 747s were rolling off the line, but there were no engines for them. One Boeing executive said, "We were rolling out gliders instead of airplanes."
Engines powerful enough to propel the mammoth beast were finally developed. And on September 30th, 1968, Boeing rolled out the first ever jumbo jet for the world to see. But hidden behind the hoopla was a dark secret. Building the 747 had driven Boeing to the brink of bankruptcy. At his home in Seattle, William Allen, the president of Boeing, couldn't sleep. He was tormented by the prospect that his decision to make the 747 was going to destroy Boeing. Late at night, Allen wrote about this nightmare scenario.
January 31st, 1970. I must not let these monumental problems destroy me. The magnitude of the risk and the capital required were sufficiently great that we knew it would be a strain on the Boeing company. I must face the problems without flinching. Do what is best for the creditors, customers, stockholders, and employees. I must learn to live with this critical situation until it is solved.
For several years, Boeing teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. But then orders for the jumbo jet began to roll in. Ultimately, building the 747 turned out to be one of the best investments the company had ever made.
The 747 is possibly, arguably, the most important plane in the history of aviation because it marks the transformation of the aviation industry from an elite, high-tech business into a mass sort of hamburger and cola business. The implications of that plane have been enormous. It created mass tourism. The fact that people move around the world and the world has become a very small place is a result of the 747.
The 747 was the last in a long line of airplanes that owed their existence to the dreams of Juan Trippe.
Well, he was probably the single most important man in aviation history, with the possible exception of Lindbergh, Lindbergh performed a stunt, but once Lindbergh's flight was over, Trippe was the single most important figure in aviation for the next 41 years. And of course his influence lasted. You could say his influence is over now because Pan Am no longer exists. Perhaps that's true. But it would be impossible for anybody ever to write a history of commercial aviation, it seems to me, and not name Juan Trippe number one.
Above all, Trippe had been a visionary. And the movement that he started, flying more people cheaper, was soon going to take the world of flying by storm. In the 1960s, America's domestic airlines seemed poised for the same kind of boom Pan Am was experiencing. There was only one thing standing in the way: their tickets cost too much. Since the 1930s, the U.S. government had been regulating ticket prices, setting them artificially high to ensure that companies like United, American, and Eastern would thrive.
The government passed through automatic price increases so that the airline men could pay for this cool new equipment that they wanted to have, the latest and best in their fleet. And the consequence of that was that there were a lot of really cool airplanes flying. But a further consequence was they were flying half empty because it was just too expensive for anyone other than a business traveler or a very well-heeled leisure traveler to afford the space.
Far from getting better, things kept getting worse. By the early 1970s, the government's Civil Aeronautics Board was regulating not just ticket prices, but nearly every aspect of flying. At the CAB office in Washington, D.C., the overworked head of the agency, Alfred Kahn, was charged with making decisions from the very mundane to the downright confusing.
May a carrier transport horses from Florida to somewhere in the Northeast? Scheduled carrier pick up stranded charter customers and carry them on seats that would otherwise be empty? Is it any wonder that I ask myself every day, is this action necessary? May the employees of two affiliated airlines wear similar-looking uniforms? Is this what my mother raised me to do?
One thing was clear to Alfred Kahn: regulation was ruining the industry. Kahn began lobbying Congress to change things. But how? Out in Texas, one tiny airline had come up with an answer. The year was 1966. The place, a fancy club in San Antonio. Rollin King had a dream of starting an airline. He figured that the one person crazy enough to help him pull off this audacious plan was his friend, Herb Kelleher. They decided to discuss the idea over cocktails. When he had Kelleher right where he wanted him, King made his pitch.
Because we'd fly only in Texas, we wouldn't be subject to Civil Aeronautics Board restrictions, and that offers all sorts of blessings and benefits right there.
Then Rollin grabbed a cocktail napkin and drew a triangle. On each corner, he put one of the three biggest cities in Texas.
You got to have a commercially booming state with some really big cities far enough apart to make bus or car travel inconvenient. Offhand, I can't think of but two states like that. California's one. The other state is Texas, Herb, and we don't have an airline like that. We could offer rates so low, people would fly instead of drive.
Herb Kelleher had to think about it. He decided it was a crazy idea, and that he was all for it.
Herb Kelleher and the people that founded Southwest Airlines with him deserve the credit for understanding that there was a price point at which masses of people were going to stuff themselves like sardines into airplanes. That there was this latent human yearning to travel quickly to nearby towns.
Remember what it was like before there was somebody else up there who loved you?
Southwest's business soon began to take off, helped by a splashy ad campaign.
With first-class legroom, free cocktails for everyone, and a schedule you could depend on.
Southwest's marketing relied almost exclusively on sex. Flight attendants in hot pants sold Southwest as the love airline.
Our love service just means having things around to make you happy. Like me.
In-flight almonds were love bites, and the automatic ticket dispenser was called a quickie machine. But beneath all the hype, Southwest succeeded by being simple in an increasingly complicated world.
Southwest only flies between point A and point B, back and forth again. They fly relatively the same distances. That means they need only one type of aircraft, the Boeing 737. Southwest has an extremely simple formula. In fact, it's fair to say that Herb Kelleher may be the first person in the airline industry to make simplicity a core strategy.
Ultimately, Southwest proved that an airline that wasn't protected by government regulation could still turn a profit by meeting the tremendous public demand for cheaper tickets. Members of Congress, anxious to promote air travel, soon began using Southwest as an example of the promise of aviation without regulation. It was the beginning of a revolution in our relationship with flying. In 1978, an earth-shaking transformation took place in the airline business. After more than 4 decades of oversight, Congress passed a law allowing airlines to set their own fares and choose their own routes. They would have to live or die based on the marketplace. The era of deregulation was born. On the plus side, tickets would be cheaper. On the minus side, huge airlines employing tens of thousands could be destroyed. Aviation was about to change from a labor of love to a business where the bottom line ruled. With the advent of deregulation, an entirely new type of airline executive emerged, more trained in navigating business deals than in flying through turbulent skies. Probably the most well-known and controversial among the new breed was Frank Lorenzo.
We were bringing a financial approach to the business. We were not aviators. We were financial guys that liked this business. We saw tremendous opportunity with leverage, tremendous opportunity to provide to the customer what the customer was looking for. And these were really kind of new ways of looking at the business.
Lorenzo's first venture in commercial aviation was helping the small regional carrier, Trans-Texas Air, live up to its new, more worldly name, Texas International. Like Southwest, Texas International was determined to take advantage of deregulation. But in contrast to the Love Airlines motto of simplicity, Lorenzo's goal was to build a far-flung empire. To expand his reach, Lorenzo began acquiring faltering competitors. Sometimes his approach was likened to a hostile takeover.
In the years I covered Frank Lorenzo, he was urgently trying to build critical mass, which to him, as I recall, meant attaining a certain size that he was invulnerable, impregnable to competitors, that he would aggregate so many passengers through his route network that he would be the king of the hill of the airlines. And for a while he was.
Lorenzo's most controversial actions came in 1983, after he acquired a financially strapped Continental Airlines. The trouble began when his cost-cutting measures ignited a war with labor unions.
What was happening is in union negotiations, Our cost structure was being compared to American and United, which operated in different parts of the country and were not exposed to the kind of low-cost competition that we were. We knew we had to make cost changes. We knew they were going to be painful to do, but we didn't know any other way to have the company survive.
Determined to avoid a protracted struggle with his unions, Lorenzo launched a preemptive attack. He declared bankruptcy, which enabled him to ignore his existing union contracts. Then he fired all his employees and invited 1/3 of them back at lower salaries. In response, the unions vilified Frank Lorenzo.
He simply came in one morning and said, "This is what you're going to make now. And by the way, that contract that promised you something else is no longer in force because we just filed for bankruptcy protection." That move so outraged and offended his own workforce, certainly, but also the flying public, certainly the regulators, Congress. Everyone got into Lorenzo bashing, and he never really overcame the damage to his reputation.
Lorenzo defended his hardline approach by claiming that it was the only thing that could have kept Continental afloat. But his cutthroat tactics would soon reveal the darker side of deregulation by destroying one of the oldest and most respected carriers in the business. In 1986, Lorenzo acquired a faltering Eastern Airlines. Then he implemented the cost-cutting measures for which he was famous.
Eastern Airlines, Union Plastic, Frank Lorenzo, Union Plastic.
When the unions refused to give in, Eastern, which had been flying since 1928, was grounded for good. Many blamed Lorenzo and the heartless atmosphere created by deregulation. But according to Lorenzo, the turmoil brought on by deregulation was worth it.
I couldn't imagine today a regulated industry in the same manner that it was 20, 30 years ago. The public would be getting a vastly different product. It's not been an unmixed blessing. There have been some fallouts from it that have hurt, but on balance, it's been a tremendous thing and been a very positive thing for the consumer and for the shareholders of airlines in total.
But the 40,000 men and women who lost their jobs with the demise of Eastern could hardly be blamed for failing to see the positive side of the brave new world of deregulation. At the same time that aviation was making a break with its past, two of the giants who had started it all were on the verge of leaving the scene. In July of 1974, Charles Lindbergh was in a hospital in New York City, suffering from lymphatic cancer. His doctors told him that he had only 2 weeks to live. Lindbergh wanted to tell his old friend Juan Trippe that the end was near. The paths of the two men had been intertwined for over 40 years. They had traveled the world together, with Lindbergh serving as Trippe's advisor. Each of their journeys driven by the shared belief that aviation could benefit mankind. Now, it was time to say goodbye. According to Trippe's secretary, the men talked for 2 hours. Trippe just sat in his chair, with tears pouring down his face. After taking care of his goodbyes, Lindbergh had just one more wish: to spend his last days in his beloved Hawaii. Against his doctor's orders, Lindbergh boarded a DC-8 bound for Maui. His last flight reminded his wife Anne of his pioneering transatlantic trip. She said no one believed he could do either and survive. Lindbergh was sustained by his faith that his connection to flying would be an eternal one.
After my death, the molecules of my being will return to the earth and sky. They came from the stars. I am of the stars.
After 9 days in Maui, Charles Lindbergh died. Juan Trippe, now retired, was about to suffer another loss: Pan Am. Operating within the new rules of deregulation was a tremendous challenge for all the major carriers, but few were less prepared for it than Pan Am. Regulation had been good to the airline. From the 1930s through the 50s, Pan Am had enjoyed a virtual monopoly on international routes and a reputation as the most prestigious airline in the world.
One of the early Pan Am people, John Leslie, he once said that when he got out of college, everybody wanted to go to work either for Time Incorporated or for Pan Am. These were the companies that had this, mystique is too weak a word. They were something new. They were changing the world as we knew it in ways that were seen as good.
The beginning of the end for Pan Am came in 1974, when the airline purchased expensive 747s in a weak market. Adding to the problem, they had no domestic routes. Under deregulation, they could buy these routes, but Pan Am lacked the credit to make it happen. In a last attempt to acquire domestic rights, Pan Am purchased National Airlines. But a fierce bidding war with Frank Lorenzo forced them to pay much more than the airline was worth. The end of a glorious era was not far off.
The death of Pan Am, to me, represents a terrific sadness. Very soon, people will forget that Pan Am ever existed. And that's sad. Companies do have personalities. They do have life, some of them. Pan Am literally went around the world. Nobody else did that. And because it fathered all these advances in aviation, it gave the world, it gave America the world. It was part of American dominance of the world.
In 1993, Pan Am's name and trademarks were sold for a little over $1 million. The buyers began a passenger shuttle service, flying the still majestic blue and white airplanes. But the airline that Juan Trippe created was gone forever. As commercial aviation entered an era of ferocious competition, airlines weren't the only ones falling by the wayside. In the early 1970s, the Lockheed Corporation introduced their own jumbo jet to compete with Boeing's 747. The L-1011 was hailed as a magnificent plane, but it turned out to be a financial disaster. Deep in debt, Lockheed was forced to leave the business in 1983. Boeing's only other American competitor, McDonnell Douglas, barely managed to survive a similar debacle. It seemed that Boeing was destined to enjoy a virtual monopoly, not only in America, but in the entire world. For the Europeans, it was a difficult idea to stomach.
If you go back to around 1970, I think many European industrial and political leaders saw a great threat of American dominance. They saw, this great American economic juggernaut rolling over Europe. They saw sort of Mickey Mouse culture, McDonald's culture, hamburgers all on every sort of street corner in Paris. And they wanted to find a way of resisting it. And the aerospace industry looked like something where they had a history of technical excellence, and it looked like very advanced, cutting-edge technology in 1970. So they thought there could be an industry where they would pour their resources, where they would make their stand and try and create something that was European, that could stand up against the American giants.
In their determination to compete with Boeing, the Europeans came up with a remarkable collaborative agreement to create a new commercial aircraft manufacturer, Airbus Industry. The company would be comprised of German, French, Spanish, and British manufacturers. If successful, the joint venture could become a model for European collaboration. Bernard Latier, one of the presidents of Airbus, had been involved in previous French commercial aviation projects, such as the supersonic Concorde.
I loved Concorde as a mistress and Airbus as a son. At 44, I decided it was time to give up my mistress and concentrate on my son's upbringing.
The first jet Airbus rolled out was the A300, which boasted wide-body capacity, powered by just 2 engines. They sold a mere 38 of them over 6 years. Bernard Latier was well aware that the company had a long way to go.
When I took over, things at Airbus were not brilliant. We were losing contracts to Boeing. Neither Boeing nor McDonnell Douglas believed in us. They were too busy biting each other's tails. But they then found that little Red Riding Hood, which was Airbus, had the surprising ability to bite the posterior of the big bad American wolf.
An historic milestone was reached in April of 1977, when Airbus made their first sale to an American airline. From then on, the orders steadily rose until Airbus became a legitimate competitor of Boeing. One of the great corporate battles of all time was underway. In the years that followed, neither company would act without seriously considering the position of its adversary.
Airbus and Boeing view each other with a kind of mutual mistrust and loathing that's natural in a duopoly. I mean, there are only 2 players in this industry. So if you can imagine it, there's basically 60 customers out there, and there's 2 suppliers, and they know each other intimately. I mean, they bash up against each other every single day. And every single time an airliner buys a new plane, they have a choice of 2. They have a choice of Boeing and Airbus. The level of sort of mistrust between these 2 companies can't begin to be exaggerated.
These 2 titans of the industry represent 2 different ways of doing business, 2 different cultures. American versus European. Boeing is a private corporation, but one that often benefits from government contracts. Airbus is a government-funded consortium, but one that now faces the pressure of turning a profit. One key confrontation came in 1997, when Airbus made a move to acquire McDonnell Douglas. Boeing quickly made a better offer and snatched up its only remaining American competitor. Now, the key battleground for Boeing and Airbus is the future.
Airbus's vision for the future is really quite straightforward. They see Airbus as the dominant producer of commercial jet airliners in the world. Some years they're up to 50% of the market against a very tough and aggressive competitor in Boeing, and they see themselves overtaking, and their strategy for overtaking Boeing is the 3XX, is the new super jumbo.
The Airbus 3XX is their grand vision for the future. This super jumbo is a double-decker airplane that will hold as many as 650 passengers. With this new wide-body and their increasingly popular small jets, Airbus hopes to dominate the commercial aircraft market.
They hope to strand the 747, which is the core of the Boeing product line, in the middle as a kind of sort of beached whale left over from 1960s technology, outmoded, out of date.
To evade the Airbus trap, Boeing is going into overdrive.
Boeing is in quite a hard place commercially because it has to defend itself. It is the dominant player in this industry, and it has this very aggressive competitor in Airbus. I mean, one thing it could do is it could build its own super jumbo, but that would cannibalize its own market, so it's quite hard for Boeing to do that. At the moment, their strategy is very much sort of keeping the dogs at the door and keeping Airbus out.
Considering the vast sums of money at stake, it's likely that Airbus and Boeing will be locked in battle for years to come, each trying to capture new markets before the other one gets there first. Of course, for most people who fly, which company's plane they happen to be on is not especially important. They have a far higher priority: getting there safely. Throughout the history of commercial aviation, the greatest leaps forward in safety have been driven by the worst disasters. In 1960, a tragic mid-air collision occurred over Brooklyn, New York, when an air traffic controller couldn't keep two planes apart on his radar screen. One of the planes, a United Airlines DC-8, came hurtling out of the cloudy skies and crashed into an apartment building. Terrified people ran into the streets, where they witnessed the worst disaster in the history of commercial aviation. The crash triggered an uproar, one that led in 1965 to the installation of computers to make the skies safer. Before computers, managing air traffic was a primitive process. Controllers used grease pencils, plastic cutouts, and often blurry radar screens to track each flight. All of that was changed by computers. Not only did they improve the quality of radar, they gave controllers three-dimensional information, showing an airplane's altitude as well as its location. According to one controller, it required a special kind of individual to master the new technology.
It was like being inside a video game. It was always something different. When I worked the airplanes, swishing them in and out, I'd have problems I had to pose instant solutions for. And they had to work. We used a sixth sense, one the computers will never have. We had to learn to flow with the traffic, as if it were an art form or part of some piece of music. You had to be the best controller in the facility, and well on your way to claiming the title. The Clint Eastwood syndrome was alive and well where we worked.
Now at the bottom, contact Macalester Tower, 118.2.
Today, we are again in a situation like the early 60s. The number of airliners in the world has more than tripled, and the technology is having a hard time keeping up. Once again, the experts are talking about overcrowded skies and gridlocked airports.
You don't actually ever run out of airspace, you run out of time. If I have 10 airplanes that want to use the same airspace at the same time, then the 10th airplane has to wait a long time to use the airspace. It's not unlike any network system where there's only so much room and there are more airplanes that want to use the system than the system is capable of handling.
One country that has been aggressively upgrading its system is Canada. This is NAV Canada's air traffic control tower at Pearson Airport in Toronto. NAV Canada is staying ahead of the curve by using 21st century technology to control the ever-increasing number of planes flying into Toronto. Here, controllers even have touchscreen computers to enable them to work as efficiently as possible. And efficiency translates into safety. But airports in the US and the rest of the world don't yet have the technology they do in Toronto.
Well, the solution to air traffic congestion is to design a new system. Now, that is a long-term solution. Now, while you're designing the new system, you have to be making the most out of your old system. In a sense, we're trying to drive along a highway at 60 miles an hour while we're changing our tires. And it's a very difficult proposition, but it's one challenge I think we're all trying to make and trying to fulfill at this time.
This controller's map charts all flights over North America at any given time. It is a graphic illustration of how much flying has become a part of our way of life. But it also reveals how close the system is coming to overload. A prospect made more frightening by predictions that the number of planes in the skies will soon triple again. When considering flight in the 21st century, our single greatest challenge is to meet the ever-increasing demand for air travel safely. A fierce storm has hit Toronto. Roads and highways are covered with ice and snow, making driving treacherous. But at the airport, planes are still taking off and landing. Air Canada Flight 23 is scheduled to leave for Ottawa in 17 minutes. There is just one problem. The aircraft is covered with ice. Toronto has the best de-icing facility in the world. Still, some of us cannot imagine being on Flight 23 without being very nervous.
The scariness of strapping yourself in and having to turn control over to somebody else and to a contraption you really don't understand. This is one of the ultimate losses of control that we experience in modern life.
No matter how much we fly, for the vast majority of us, it remains, at least in part, an unnatural experience.
Now, people were not expected to look down at clouds when they started walking around the face of the earth. And there you are, you're looking down at the clouds, You may go through a thunderstorm. You could be hit by lightning. I mean, there are all of these things that could happen in a part of our environment which we just never expected to be part of.
Yet, if we sometimes can't help giving into our fear of flying, perhaps we should also be willing to take a look at the other side of that coin. What an incredible thing it is to fly. Every year at the Oshkosh Air Show in Wisconsin, people from all over the world come to pay homage to flight and to see the skies filled with every aircraft imaginable. Here, it is easy to remember the early days of aviation and the pioneers that had unlimited dreams of what flying could do for mankind. One of those dreamers was the French aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He believed aviation would bring people closer together.
The central struggle of men has been to understand one another, to join together. And it is this very thing that the airplane helps them to do. It begins by annihilating time and space.
For Charles Lindbergh, traveling in a plane to far-off places was a way to explore the meaning of his own life.
I may be flying a complicated airplane, rushing through space. But in this cabin, I am surrounded by simplicity and thoughts set free of time. The grandeur of the world outside, the nearness of death, the longness of life.
For the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, the most interesting part of all was the view.
It is breathtaking to rise up over the world one has been living in, all simplified and clear-cut in patterns which time and history will straighten out. I cannot help feeling that it would do something wonderful for the human race, rid it of much smallness and pettiness, if more people flew.
We are now a century removed from the birth of powered flight. During that time, the dreams and accomplishments of aviation's visionaries have transformed the way we live. And yet, ironically, most of us take this astounding invention for granted. In such an era, perhaps it is too much to expect that our thoughts fill with joy and hope each time we board a plane. But maybe it's not too much to suggest that the next time you fly, you ask for a window seat, keep the shade open, and enjoy the view.
The Chasing the Sun adventure continues at PBS Online. Relive the romance of the golden age of flying. Trace the evolution of the world's greatest planes. Learn about the real lives of aviation's pioneers. The interactive journey begins at pbs.org. Chasing the Sun was made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. To order a video cassette of this program or the complete 4-part boxed set collection of Chasing the Sun, call 1-800-343-4727 or write to the address on your screen.
This is PBS.